The thing about emotional eating is a diet won't fix it. You can't just go on a diet and have it go away, because people who are emotional eaters and have this emotional dependence on food can't diet. Like, you can do it for a time, but you'll bust out.
Welcome to the Betty Rocker Show, the place to be to nourish your mind, love your body, and rock your life. What's up, rock stars? Coach Betty Rocker here, and welcome back to the show. My guest today is Tricia Nelson, an emotional eating expert and the author of the #1 bestselling book, Heal Your Hunger: 7 Simple Steps to End Emotional Eating Now. Tricia herself lost 50 pounds by identifying and healing the underlying causes of her emotional eating, and has spent over 30 years researching the hidden causes of the addictive personality. She's the host of the popular podcast, The Heal Your Hunger Show, and is a highly regarded speaker who has been featured on NBC, CBS, KTLA, Fox, and Discovery Health. Join me in welcoming her to the show. Welcome, Tricia. It's so wonderful to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm super happy to be here.
So your subject matter, emotional eating, is such a hot topic for so many women and men, I'm sure, as well. But I primarily have women who listen, so I want to address their needs today and have you teach us more about this topic, because boy, it's something that as soon as I hear emotional eating, I'm like, am I emotionally eating when I'm stressed? Or like, what does it mean specifically to be an emotional eater?
Yeah, I think there are misconceptions about it. And I mean, in the most simple way, it's really stuffing feelings with food. Okay. It's really like, I'm not feeling comfortable in my skin. I'm going to nibble and snack, and then I'll feel more comfortable. So it's very simple. It's just we use food for reasons beyond nutritional need, and it works. And it's usually not salads that we reach for. It's like carbs and sugar and heavier foods, because they work. They actually do take the edge off. And so that's really what we're doing when we're emotionally eating.
That makes sense. So there's an association with a strong sense of an emotional state. And then we are choosing, well, we may not consciously be choosing, but we're choosing to eat something to mitigate the feeling state that we have.
100%. And I think that was really key what you said, that it's not conscious all the time. And most of the time it really isn't, because it does turn into a habit. Like, we just do it. It's what we do. Our orientation towards life becomes just food related, and it becomes this habit. And for some people like myself, because I was an emotional eater, I think as far back as I can remember.
Yes, I was just going to ask, how did you get into this work? Exactly. Tell us all about this journey.
Totally. I really was an emotional eater, I think, from the get-go. But of course, I didn't know it. It was unconscious, and I thought I just liked food. And I think a lot of people, when they first think of emotional eating, are like, oh, that's not me. I just like food. But once I heard the term, I think I was about 17 years old or so, I started to observe that my eating was different than my friends, So I just loved food. I loved to eat. I loved to cook. I loved to serve it to other people, go out to dinner, like anything having to do with food. I was so excited. And again, I didn't see anything wrong with it, but of course I started to gain weight, and that was a problem. So by age 21, I was 50 pounds overweight, and I had this roll on my tummy that I would scrunch up on my hands, and I would imagine cutting off, like you cut fat off the side of a steak. I know, isn't that awful? I would have like thoughts like, oh, maybe I'll get some disease where I automatically lose weight, because I hated to diet. So some crazy thoughts, but it was really just, born out of my frustration with trying diets and not being able to lose weight and keep it off. I mean, I could lose weight, but I always put it back on. I was one of those yo-yoers. So like I'd gain 30, lose 20, gain 10. And I had like 5 different sizes of pants in my closet, because I never knew what size I would be. And to this day, I can look back at a picture in my past, and I know how I felt about my body at those moments, whenever that picture was taken. So it was very much an obsession for me, something I thought about really constantly. Either I think about food constantly, or what can I do to get the weight off, And so that's part of being an emotional eater too, I think, is the obsession.
That there's such a negative feedback loop and mental feedback loop in what I'm hearing from you, just about how you were unhappy with your body, and that emotion probably made you want to eat more, and then you ate more, and then you were more unhappy with your body. And it wasn't really your body or the food that was the issue. It was this association with emotional state, right? That was more that you're identifying as this issue that people struggle with.
Yeah, I mean, again, I had no idea I was eating over my emotions because it works. If you eat carby, snacky, sugary foods and you don't feel as much, you don't know you have emotions that are driving you to eat. So, yes, the whole cycle is part of what drives the emotional eating, because if you eat something and you feel bad about it, and then you have all these self-recriminating thoughts, that totally just perpetuates the whole cycle again. So definitely there's a lot involved. And the thing about emotional eating is a diet won't fix it.
Right.
Like you can't just go on a diet and have it go away, because people who are emotional eaters and have this emotional dependence on food can't diet. Like you can do it for a time, but you'll bust out. For me, it was like 2 weeks or so. Because at first when you go on a diet, you're like, I'm doing it. Like I got my new food plan and my exercise plan. I'm doing it. I'm looking good, feeling good. People are commenting. It feels really good at first, but then that abates, and then you're just stuck with all the emotions that you weren't aware of before because they were stuffed down with food and excess weight. When that stuff comes to the surface, if somebody doesn't have the tools to deal with all those emotions, it's going to get hard. The diet's going to get hard and no longer fun. And then it's going to be like, give me my chocolate again.
So I think you've identified for us one great way to kind of tell, okay, so my diet's not working. This is one maybe ding of like, maybe this is emotional eating. And we do physically get hungry. How do you determine if you're eating emotionally or if you're eating because you're physically hungry? Like, how can someone kind of figure this out?
Yeah. And I will say, I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and I'll still get fooled sometimes. Like I'll be sitting at my computer and all of a sudden I'll feel hungry and I'll say to myself, I'm so hungry. And then I have to have a little conversation with myself. Like, really? Are you really hungry? Are you starving? And one of the things that helps me tremendously is having a regular schedule for eating. Like I recommend 3 meals a day with nothing in between. And I affectionately call it 3-meal magic, because it's regular. It keeps you regular. The next meal is coming. You're not playing games with yourself or trying to skip meals, which is a total trap for binging, later in the evening. And I also feel like it's very self-caring. And even if somebody wants to do intermittent fasting, you can still put 12 hours between your dinner and your breakfast, but having a breakfast, lunch, and dinner, I find for emotional eaters to be really helpful, because when we do starve or skip meals, there's a little alarm system that goes off in our head that tells us we're starving and we have to eat everything in sight. So when our window opens up, if you're doing IF, you can go overboard. And I hear that a lot from people, is they can't really control themselves. And so I just feel like the 3 meals is very loving and self-caring. Like, it's like, how would you treat your little girl? Would you tell your little girl, you're going to go all day without eating because you're going to lose a couple pounds faster? You wouldn't do that to your kid, right? And so why are we doing it to ourselves as adults? So the reason why 3-meal magic's really helpful too is when I have that inspiration that I'm starving and I should go eat something, I can check in with myself. And if I have had a good, healthy breakfast, and it's only been a couple hours, I can kind of reason my way out of it. Like, really, you're probably not starving. You had a really healthy meal, and you're going to have lunch in a couple hours or 3 hours or so. And so you can probably do it, And I will say the 3-meal magic way of eating is really helpful too, because snacking is so much of where we put on weight. The snacky foods are usually not healthy foods, or they're not foods we can control. And so we end up overeating on them. But I just find that having a regular way of eating, regular schedule of eating, can really lessen my misinterpreting hunger pangs as being physical. And if I have indeed had a good breakfast, then I can say, okay, Trish, what's really going on? And I can do a little sleuthing. What am I feeling anxious about? Or what don't you want to do? What are you trying to avoid? And there's always like a phone call I don't want to make, or my taxes that I want to avoid. And then I can kind of see what is going on, what's kind of eating at me, where I want to go distract myself by going to the kitchen and looking at the refrigerator.
Wow, that was a lot of really helpful information. And I want to go back to this little trap that we get into of skipping meals. And I personally think intermittent fasting is not a very good thing for women. The science was all done, all the research was done on men, and it does have benefits for men. But for women, I am with you 100% on, if you want to fast, go between dinner and breakfast. This is a great natural fast that your body is perfectly well set up for. And I really like the 3-meal magic if you do think that you may have some of this emotional eating going on, with the caveat that you are eating wholesome, filling meals that you are pointing out as well. And, the most satisfying of the 3 macronutrients, of course, is protein. And I find in my work with women that a lot of women get this incorrect message from marketing that protein is for men or for bodybuilders. And so when we start to talk about maybe thinking about nourishment and what we need in our bodies to thrive, we want to base it on whole foods, but that protein intake is so important. And as we age, we need more protein. We don't absorb our aminos as readily. So we need to continue to increase that, especially over 40. So these are certain tweaks that you can think about, because I feel like cravings for food come from a lot of places, but the emotional cravings are really tough. So you can at least make sure you're getting your baseline nutritional needs met by maximizing these 3 meals that you're going to have each day and making sure that you have the right nutrients on your plate. So I really appreciate that. Yeah. And I will say to my fitness women listening, there's a time window that you should be eating in with it when you're working out. And I do not believe in snacking either. I will say, however, that if you are doing a tough training session and you need an additional meal, just think of it as fuel for your amazing body, and go for that protein shake and fruit or something that's, again, focused on the protein. So I so appreciate all of this emotional eating conversation. I just also want to touch on these other aspects of it, because it seems that, gosh, why does eating ever have to be so hard for us? It's
right.
We're surrounded by all these messages and all these layers. And then at the end of the day, we're all just trying to get through the day, trying to do all this work. And, we get anxious about things. We get hungry, and we get hangry, and we get all these things, right? Is hangry the perfect storm of emotional eating, basically?
Yeah, it's so, I know it well. But again, putting 4 or 5 hours between each meal, I find to be so balancing, where I don't have to get too hungry. And it's not a cardinal rule. If I need to have something, to make it through to dinner or something like that, it's not the end of the world to have something healthy. But I generally just feel like it's good training for my body to be able to feel some hunger. And one of the main reasons I recommend 3-meal magic is because, not so much for diet purposes, but it's in between the meals that we start to be able to recognize what our emotions are. And when we're numb all the time, we don't know what our emotions are because we don't have any, and so much of that hunger in between and that uncomfortableness, which for my clients at first, they're like, what? I can't eat between meals. What am I going to do? I'm like, you're going to feel you're going to have some feelings, and you're going to get acclimated to those feelings. And I give them new tools, to deal with the feelings instead of just sitting there and suffering. But it's very informative, to start to tune in and say, what am I feeling? What's going on with me? Because we have to have that, we have to build that emotional intelligence where we do get to know ourselves and what we're feeling. And we can identify when our feelings are hurt, or when we feel anxious, or, when something's coming up and we're unsure of ourselves and feeling vulnerable. We have to start to learn to identify those feelings so we don't get driven to the refrigerator by them, that we can start to really address them. And that's really, that's so healthy to have emotions, identify emotions, have a way of processing them through writing and talking and, different just healthy tools. That's how we grow up emotionally. That's how we start to deal.
As children, we learned to self-soothe when we were hurt in a lot of different ways. But I feel like the comfort foods were, for a lot of people, were something that were a soothing tactic, either given by a caregiver, parent, or the child learned to go to sugar or go to something comforting when they were hurting. So I love that you're addressing that. It's important to, as adult people now, we need to identify that we are self-soothing with food, and usually unhealthy food. Or it's not that the food is always unhealthy. It's just that it's an unhealthy association that we're making with food, and it's subconscious. So coming up with better tools for our soothing behavior and addressing the actual root cause of the issue, like you're saying. So you mentioned journaling. What are some other tools that you empower your clients with when they're shifting their focus to new ways of coping?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important that we start our day with some kind of morning routine that can give us a real foundation that we can work from throughout the day. Because if we pop out of bed and we're on Instagram and, Facebook and answering phone calls, we're really starting at a deficit. So I call it putting money in your spiritual bank account. So you make deposits first thing in the morning, and you do it like a meditation, praying, reading spiritual literature, motivational literature, walking in nature, yoga, whatever it is that's really centering, that helps you just tap in and tune in.
I use a gratitude practice personally.
I love that. Yeah, gratitude list. It's so powerful. And when we do that, we're putting money in our spiritual bank account, and we can take withdrawals later in the day, because stress will pile up. We will add stress throughout the day. It'll get harder and harder. And my experience is emotional eaters have their hardest time in the late afternoon and into the evening. And part of that is because we've added so much stress in our day. So if we can start with like some resources, feed ourselves, nourish ourselves, through some kind of practice that can help you feel centered, and really nourished at a deeper level, then you're going to have a better time throughout the day, an easier time saying no to those quick snacky foods. I also like meditation late in the day too, to throw off stress, and there's other tools, like walking and yoga and those kinds of things late in the day also, or a phone call to a girlfriend, just to throw off stress. So we're not just, it's easy to get low energy late in the day. I get a slump late in the day, after I've been working all day. And that's when I take my break and meditate. I do TM. So I do that second meditation, and it just perks me right up. But that's the time when I used to reach for chocolate, reach for coffee, reach for something snacky.
Right. And TM, for those of you who don't know what that is, that's transcendental meditation. And this is so amazing and helpful, because I think, a lot of people who work throughout the day, they get a lot of decision fatigue, and they identify that as hunger or as low energy state. And it could be low energy availability if you are not eating and nourishing yourself appropriately. But that slump you identified, like that happens sort of like maybe an hour or so before dinner, after you've finished work or you're towards the end of the workday. So important to identify that and do something supportive to yourself. And like you said, like maybe it's meditation practice. For me, I love to go play with my dog and give him lots of attention, because it drops me right back into the moment. It grounds me. I'm so grateful for his company and that he's so playful. And I, just like paying attention to your pets or something that gives you back so much love is like another great check-in for yourself.
Absolutely. Or just taking a 10-minute walk, or,
I love that.
Yeah, or putting on like your earbuds and playing like a really great rock out song, and just sort of get the beat going. I mean, anything that'll just like increase your energy, give you a reset that's not food related, and it works better. I mean, it just works better, and there's no adverse side effects.
I love that. That's so fantastic. And so there's one thing that kind of comes up around emotional eating that comes to mind for me. I think a lot about addictive behaviors. And this feels a lot like an addictive type of associative behaviors can be addicting as well. Is there a difference in food addiction versus emotional eating, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So my thoughts are that we're all emotional eaters. I'm just going to indict everybody now. So I think we're all emotional eaters, but it is a spectrum. And so, and I say that because I think we all have the, propensity to find comfort in food and to once in a while go overboard. I think it just happens to everybody. And so, but you're not necessarily taking it to the lengths I took it to, where I would literally binge and have my cookies and my ice cream and my chips, because you have to have salty with your sweet, and and sit in front of the TV and go to town. That's kind of where I took it.
You mentioned obsessive earlier. That was the hallmark of that behavior for you, was that it was obsessive.
Yes, absolutely. And destructive.
Right.
And so this spectrum is really, I have emotional eating on the low end of the spectrum and food addiction, which is where I lived, on the high end of the spectrum. And I actually have a quiz on my website that people can take to find out where you are on the spectrum. But what really will inform that are two things. One is the level of control that you have to scale back or to course correct. So let's say you go on a cruise, you eat a lot of, yummy foods and things you don't normally eat, and you drink a lot of wine, and you've gained 5 pounds. So you come home and you're like, pants are too tight. I'm going to do extra workouts and cut out sugar. So boom, in, a week or two's time, you've lost 5 pounds, your clothes are fitting better again, and it wasn't a big deal. That's somebody on the low end of the spectrum, because they have control where they can course correct and not a whole lot of consequences. Okay. 5 pounds that they got out of, really easily. Whereas somebody on the high end of the spectrum, again, with the measurement of control and consequences, they can't necessarily course correct. They come back from the cruise, they feel so bad about their choices that they just keep it going, and they keep binging, and they're like, what's the use? I might as well eat now. I blew it. I might as well eat. So then they just keep gaining weight and keep feeling bad about their choices. And if you do the yo-yo dieting thing long enough, you're going to have a lot of issues, or you're carrying excess weight. You're going to pre-diabetes, diabetes, joint pain, joint replacements. It gets bad. I talk to women who have been on the dieting merry-go-round for decades, and it's, the consequences on the toll it takes on our body alone, but not to mention other consequences, like we're not as productive. We are low, our self-esteem drops. We don't want to have sex because we don't want to be seen or touched. There's so many consequences to being in this trap with food. And when those pile up, that's somebody that will sort of put somebody at the higher end of this, more in the food addiction category. So I recommend people take the quiz to find out where they are in that spectrum. But I really feel like, especially as women, because we're emotional and we like to eat, I feel like it is customary. It's more something I think that we relate to more than men do. But I do have men who, reach out to me as well, who are, there's certainly plenty of emotional eaters who are men who are emotional eaters. But I think maybe as women, we're more in touch with the connection between the emotions and the eating.
That's interesting. And I also want to get back to addiction a little bit, because addictive behaviors tend to not be isolated. It might be that you're expressing an addiction to food right now, but that it really, you could have expressed it through shopping or through alcoholism or other types of addictive behaviors. What's your experience in working with people? Do you see that there are crossover addictions, or that they've had other types of addictive behavior in the past?
Yeah, I'll make a joke right now and say why stop at one? So one addiction, that is. And I say that because I personally have experienced plenty of addictions. So I am definitely a sugar addict, where sugar, if I eat sugar, I want more sugar. It just sort of grabs a hold of me. And it is a physical addiction, the sugar addiction, because sugar is highly addictive. But what I learned early on in my life is I was also addicted to alcohol, whereas when I drank, it grabbed a hold of me and I overdrank. So pretty early in my life, I definitely had addiction issues with regarding to alcohol, and I would black out as well. So I was super sensitive to alcohol. And I really associate the two, the sugar addiction and the alcohol issue, because alcohol is the most refined form of sugar there is. So to me, it really helped understand why my body reacted so strongly. And I really think it's my sensitivity to sugar in whatever form it comes. And with both alcohol and sugar, there's definitely a very physically addictive component. Now, there are process addictions that don't make you physically addicted, but you can have the dopamine hit that, your dopamine receptors can get really lit up from certain things that you do, like shopping, like other things. I mean, porn or other kinds of things that you can get addicted to. And that is a physical reaction that can get you hooked. And then you can have the typical signs of addiction, like tolerance, like you get lit up from a certain amount, and then you have to have more in order to get that same hit, that same lit up feeling. And so that's something. Withdrawal symptoms. If you stop something and you have withdrawal symptoms, I mean, talk about the hangry, like when I would stop eating sugar, I not only was withdrawing and had headaches, from the physical withdrawal, but from not having my fix, I would have more feelings. And that's where the angry part of hangry came in, where I just was more sensitive. Like life was closer to me because I didn't have this buffer of food. And so that's where the hangry came from for me. So exactly what I said, like if it was, why stop at one? I did have an addictive personality where I was used to medicating my feelings. Food happened to be the most accessible one for me, but I certainly didn't stop there, and so I would do things, and that's especially true with the idea of swapping addictions. I mean, if you ever drive by a church basement where there's an AA meeting, you'll see a bunch of people smoking outside the meeting. So they've basically stopped drinking, but they're smoking. Some people pick it up as soon as they stop drinking. Not always, I'm overgeneralizing, but I just mean it's very typical for people when they stop one addiction to substitute with another. Yes. Because they're still wanting that numbing effect. And that's really important to look out for.
Yes. And that's actually what I want to get at here is the numbing effect, because why do we get addicted or develop these emotional eating disorders in the first place? It's because there's some unaddressed need that is unresolved within us. And a lot of what I've been really interested in around the work around trauma and how that creates these unresolved feeling states when we have unaddressed trauma in our lives, and how that can really perpetuate into these addictive cycles because we have emotion that we cannot resolve, or we haven't had the opportunity yet to resolve or realized we should go after that as our root cause of what's sort of symptomatic in our life. So I feel like a lot of these things you're talking about are really related to issues that we have within ourselves that may need deeper work than just a gratitude list every day, right? Or a meditation daily, which I think are all great practices and can be helpful long term. However, if there's unresolved stuff in your life and it's creating all these symptoms of addiction or emotional eating, I mean, because you said that's sort of a spectrum of, food addiction is at one end of a spectrum of emotional eating. But I'm saying addiction in general is a byproduct of unresolved issues that we need to address. And I think that's really the most important thing I wanted to say about that. And I'd love your feedback on that.
Yeah, I mean, most of my clients have had trauma in their past. Most people I feel like who are chronically struggling with food and weight are driven by some of that trauma from their past. I personally had sexual abuse in my past from age 5 to 10. And so that certainly informed, my habits. So I there's no question it's got to come out, it either comes out in an unhealthy way, or we deal with it in an unhealthy way, or we deal with it in a healthy way. And I often tell people that, food is, I'm grateful I was an emotional eater because it led me on this journey of self-exploration and personal development that I would never have been interested in, had I not been driven to it. It was my only way out. I tried all the diets. I tried everything I could possibly try to deal with the symptom of overeating, the symptom of weight gain. And it all failed me. And it wasn't until I realized, hey, it's an emotional eating issue, and overweight is a symptom of overeating, and overeating is a symptom of what's eating me. And so my journey really drove me to get to that. Like, what is eating me? And I didn't need 20 years of therapy to get there either. In my experience, because this is all the only work I've ever done in my adult life, I basically have taken a lot of guesswork out of it. It's really fascinating to me in my research that emotional eaters are so common in their reactions to life. And so it's kind of like if you've met one of us, you've met all of us. And so I have something I wrote about in my book called The Anatomy of the Emotional Eater, which is 24 personality traits that make up the emotional eater's personality. Now, we don't have all these traits all the time, but people will read this list and they're like, check, check, check. And so I've taken a lot of guesswork out.
Give us a couple examples.
You bet. So one of them, and I'll also give you an example of how it's related to trauma, since that's how we got started on this topic. The number one example I would say is people pleasing. So emotional eaters are consummate people pleasers, and I was the worst offender of this. So basically what happens is, typically and often when we do have trauma as kids, perhaps we grow up with alcoholism or some kind of addiction or mental illness. And, as a kid, we don't have a lot of coping tools available to us. Like we have food, so we definitely choose food, but we can't go score drugs. It's like we're kids. And so we have to resort to other coping tools that we have. People pleasing is a good one, because if you want to mitigate a parent's reaction or a violent reaction, you get really good at people pleasing. Like, what can I do to settle dad down? What can I do to get mom to not hate me or take her, rage out on me? And so you get really good at adapting. You become a chameleon, and that works as a kid. Like, that's a coping tool. It's a survival tool. So is eating. It's a survival tool as a kid. If I hadn't been an overeater, I don't know that I could have survived my childhood. Not that it was so terrible, but there was stuff, right? So I just am so glad I had food as a buffer. But when we take these coping tools into our adult life, they don't work as well. They backfire on us. So the people pleasing, saying yes to everybody, trying to be superwoman, trying to get the atta girls, like, isn't she amazing? We couldn't have done it without you. Oh, that Tricia, she just, runs circles around the rest of us. Like, all that stuff feeds our ego, but it doesn't last. We have to keep doing it. And so what happens is we really knock ourselves out. Like, we totally exhaust our adrenals. We burn the candle at both ends. We don't get enough rest, all trying to get that validation because we don't have it for ourselves. Because as kids, we sought it from outside ourselves, and we didn't have it inside. We had to get it from outside, and we keep doing it in our adult life. But the problem with doing it is not only are we exhausted, but we're also resentful, which is another one of the traits of an emotional eater. Is we're resentful because we're like, nobody's ever as pleased as we plan on them being. We're planning on having, trumpets and all kinds of celebrations around all the work that we do. And people barely notice. In fact, if we do it all the time, they take us for granted. So we're resentful and burned out. And that's the perfect storm for justifying the I deserve it binge. Like, screw them. Like, they're not going to recognize me. I'll reward myself. So do you see the connect? Of course.
Of course. What a perfect picture you just painted too of the deeper core issues behind why we get into these patterns. This is just so enlightening. And if you're listening and thinking about this, like I am, and where, because I feel like we all have a tendency to want to please other people to a certain extent,
Sure.
right? But you're talking about the deep people pleasing that burns us out, where we have no kind of filter or self-regulation ability when it comes
Right.
to that. And that's because that's how we feel like we have to get our love, or that's how we have to,
Exactly.
right? And so I feel this is just such a powerful example of some of the identifiers of the emotional eater. That's really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And your book is so wonderful. I recommend people read it because it's, even if what's great is if you identify that you're not currently an emotional eater, or that you're on the low end of the spectrum, that's great too, right? Like, it's just a good thing to know about, so that you might get into an associative state because you're in a really stressful situation at one point, and then these coping mechanisms can be really, really helpful. I feel like your book serves everyone, because whether you are a self-identified emotional eater or not, you said earlier, we're all emotional eaters at some point, right?
Yeah.
Like, whether
they're good tools. They're just good tools for healthy living. There's no question about
they're
it.
good tool, right? And not everybody
Yeah.
has a food addiction, like you said.
Right.
It's just that some people are in that sort of end of the spectrum, and that's something to really be aware of and think about, like, what are the root causes of that? So how can we? I feel like as we look at your spectrum of emotional eating, all the way up to the high end of the scale to the low end of the scale, it just feels like there maybe are different tools and strategies to address the different ends of the spectrum from what we're sort of unpacking here.
Well, and I think that a lot of these are applicable to women in general as well. Like,
Yes.
people pleasing, I think, is something we can drop into really easily as women. Also, not putting boundaries on our time, which is akin to people pleasing, right? Because we don't say no. We don't say, hey, my plate's full, I can't do it, find somebody else. But emotional eaters especially have trouble speaking up for themselves. They have trouble using their voice. And so they bury it with food. They basically stuff what they want to say. So I really do, a lot of my work is around teaching women to speak up for themselves and express when they're not happy about something or when they need something. And again, these are tools we could all use, right? And it's just like more effective communication. So we're not expecting people to be mind readers, that we actually express ourselves and what we need. And that in and of itself is such a good self-esteem building practice, like, oh, I have needs. Like I have needs. Oh, wait, I deserve to have those spoken and have people, respect those. And so again, food is just the symptom, but it leads us, the journey of overcoming any kind of disordered eating will lead us into a whole nother world of self-love and self-care that we wouldn't have been on otherwise. And so there is a silver lining to having this problem, is if you grab a hold of it and realize, this is something I say a lot, realize that it's not an eating problem, but a living problem, and if we start living differently, we can totally turn it around, because it really isn't about the food, but it's like, the cure will make us better than we would have been if we hadn't had the problem in the first place.
I love how you are talking about how we can see opportunities in all of our challenges, because I think that mindset is a mindset that will make us successful in life in any arena, which
Absolutely.
is what you're pointing out. So speaking of challenges,
Sure.
Do you have a challenge you'd like to give to our listeners today? Because I know that they'd love to keep you in mind, and I'd like to give them a challenge from you that they could do after this to sort of use some of these things that we talked about.
Totally. Well, I would say, let's circle back to the 3-meal magic. And I would say it's easy to, think you're not an emotional eater because you're not aware of these connections. But I would challenge the people listening to try eating 3 meals and have nothing in between those meals. Really be strict with yourself for 3 days. So 3 meals each day for 3 days, because I feel like that is going to help people really start to observe their relationship with food and see how often we have impulses to just get up and go unconsciously, just walk into the kitchen and grab something to eat. It's so unconscious. So this, I think, will just get people a little bit more aware and observing their relationship with food. When I first heard the terms emotional eater, and I, as I said, thought, that's not me. then I went out to lunch with my friends, and they, like, everybody ordered a sandwich and it came with fries. And I sat there, me saying I'm not an emotional eater, but I would sit there and I noticed they would eat their sandwich and pick up their fries, but I would sit there and go, how could you just pick your fries? Like, why would you leave French fries on the plate? And I noticed I would eat my fries and pick up my sandwich. So I started to observe, well, my relationship with food is different and there is a little bit more to it, And so I just feel like the 3 Meal Magic Challenge can help you, just 3 days, but that in and of itself can be pretty transformational for people when they realize how unconscious their eating is and how it really cleans things up really quickly when you just eat the 3 meals.
I love that. Thank you for that great challenge. And thank you for all of the insights and stories that you shared with us. Like, really appreciate your time and your energy, and your work in this field is just so important. I think there are a lot of people who need this message. So thank you so much for coming and being a guest.
Oh, thank you for having me. I just adore you. And thanks for all the amazing work you do in the world to inspire so many women to be healthier.
It's a thing that we share in common,
Yes,
I think, something
indeed.
that we definitely have in common. So we'll be putting all of the links to Tricia's book and her quiz and all of her wonderful material in the show notes along with this episode. And you can follow her on social media. She's so wonderful. So thanks again, Tricia, for being here. And we look forward to talking to you again. And thank you so much for tuning in today, Rockstar. It's always so nice to have you join me for these conversations, and I encourage you to use the show notes page on thebettyrocker.com/podcast to grab links and resources mentioned on today's show, and leave me any questions or comments. As always, I greatly appreciate the reviews you leave for me on iTunes and the podcast players you listen on. It means a lot to know you're enjoying the show. Coming up in our next episode, I'm talking to the founder of the Man Uncivilized movement, Trevor Boehm. He's the author of the books Today I Rise and Man Uncivilized, as well as a 2-time TEDx speaker, men's coach, and podcaster. I really appreciate the work he's doing, and I thought you might be interested to hear this conversation, especially if you have men in your life who you love and want to share great tools and resources with. In my own personal journey, learning more about how other people think has helped me up-level my communication skills, deepen my empathy and understanding, and just connect more meaningfully with others. I really love just learning different perspectives and points of view, and I think you'll find Trevor's work very insightful. I've given his books to several friends and family members and really enjoy hearing his take on many different things. This episode does have some swearing in it, as I prefer to hear him express himself unfiltered, so you've been advised in advance that there will be adult language in this episode, so you're not shocked when you hear it. And thanks so much for listening, and as always, I'm Betty Rocker, and you are so awesome and amazing. I'll talk to you again real soon.
This podcast is for information purposes only. Statements and views expressed on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Brie Argetsinger, Betty Rocker Inc., and the producers disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. Before starting a new exercise, fitness, or health protocol, or if you think you have a medical problem, always consult a licensed physician.